Hello there. My name is James Gilmer, User Services Librarian at Tiffin University. I'll be your guide today as we learn all about evaluating sources. Can you trust what you read on the internet? Let's find out. What do we already know about our topic, and what do we expect to find? These are some of the first questions we should ask ourselves and are connected to the S of the SCRAAP test, self-awareness. Being self-aware helps us to limit our own bias. When we're doing research, the easiest search results to click on and the sources that we remember best are going to be the results that we agree with. Everybody likes to be proven right. That's why it's important to keep in mind what we expect to find while we're doing research and allow ourselves to be surprised. Let's move on to currency. When we say that a resource is current, what we usually mean is that it has been published recently. How recently? That depends a little on your subject discipline. But a good rule of thumb is to use material that was published in the last 3 years. For some topics, that's not enough. Politics and technology change so fast that you'll want even more up-to-date information than that. And for some topics, we could go even farther back in time. Next, let's move on to relevance. This one can be tricky. What makes a source relevant? This is mostly a matter of fit. Is the article or source about the topic that you're working on? An article about crime rates in Cleveland might be relevant to a paper that I'm writing about the effect of government programs in fighting crime. It might not be so relevant to a paper that I'm writing that asks whether the Cleveland Browns are a good football team. Authority, on the other hand, is fairly easy to assess. We're going to do a little digging on the author of the resources that we find. We want to know where the author works and what their credentials are that allow them to write about the topic that we're researching. Authority, therefore, usually comes from college degrees and job titles. An article about the price of prescription drugs that was written by a scholar who works at Johns Hopkins Hospital is going to be far more persuasive than a blog entry by a random influencer. Credibility is another good word for authority. Authority can come from credentials. Degrees and job titles are the best example here, and they are easy to spot in the results page of a Dragon Quest search. Authority can also come from life experiences, however, which is a little harder to make sense of. Think of an event that your parents lived through that you've only read about. Your parents have a different kind of authority when they talk about that event than a scholar. First-hand accounts are primary sources, and they have a special kind of lived authority. How is a primary source different from other sources? A primary source is directly connected to a historical event, like a diary, an interview, or even an artifact. Primary sources have authority because of what they are. No degrees required. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are produced by experts using primary sources, and often other secondary sources as well. The authority of secondary sources is built upon the credentials of the author and the methods that were used in the research process. Authors are usually happy to tell us about their credentials and their methods in the source itself. We can also find this information in the library catalog record for our source, which you will see more of in a moment. Authority is undermined by bias. For instance, did you know that the development of nuclear power in the United States was undermined in the 1950s by oil companies? Newspaper articles financed by the Rockefeller Foundation, the same Rockefeller famously made wealthy through Standard Oil, and with an interest in avoiding the development of competing forms of energy, argued in the 1950s that there was no safe level of radiation exposure. The scientists who were interviewed for the article were aware that this was untrue, but buried their doubts deep in the article, using catchy headlines to draw public interest and make their case against nuclear energy. When an author distorts the facts in order to convince you of something, we call that bias. When an author distorts the facts intentionally, we call that disinformation or propaganda. Bias can also show up in less sinister ways. However, as an example, only choosing sources that we agree with for a research project is a form of unintentional bias. How do we decide if a source is accurate? This can seem overwhelming at first when you don't know much about a topic, but the more you read, the easier it becomes. Let's say that your friend tells you that your favorite show was just renewed for another season. Now, you'll probably immediately have a pretty good idea about whether that is possible or not, because you're familiar with your favorite show and you know if it's doing well or not. Do you take your friend at their word? Maybe not, especially if it sounds too good to be true. If that's the case, how can you tell if your friend is telling you the truth? That's right. You pull out your phone and do a quick Google search. You gather more information. That's really the only way to be confident that a source is accurate. You'll need to read other sources and gather more information. If 5 of your sources say one thing and your 6th source says something else, you have a dilemma and an opportunity. Accuracy questions let us engage with the debates about a topic and add our own voices to the conversation. You might be convinced that the lone source is right and the other sources are wrong. Making an argument based on what you've learned and persuading others that you're right is what research is all about. What is the author's purpose? This is the last question we need to ask ourselves when we're evaluating a source. Journal articles are published in very different ways from newspaper articles. Blog posts enter the world through different pathways from books, and a master's thesis has an entirely different purpose from a magazine article. If you haven't already, this is a great time to watch our How It Gets Published video, which will give you some important context. To summarize though, we have 2 main types of resources. Resources for specialists and resources for the general public. Resources designed for specialists don't shy away from jargon. If you read a journal article written by a history professor, chances are pretty good that you're going to hear some foreign languages and see loads of direct quotes from primary sources. You'll also know exactly where that information came from because a journal article is going to be full of citations, endnotes, footnotes, or in-text citations, depending on style, that tell you where the author got their information from. Why is that important? While you think about why that might be important, let's talk about sources for the general public. A blog post probably isn't going to quote foreign languages or primary sources in the same way that a journal article would. A magazine article definitely isn't going to. You're also much less likely to see specialized terms that would be confusing for the general public. What does this mean and why is it important, you might ask? Well, sources that are meant for the general public are easy to read. They're easy to understand. They're also harder to use because you won't know sometimes whether something you've read is the author's own opinion or backed up by hard facts. It's like a math problem where you can't see the other person's work. If they tell you the answer is 4 and someone else tells you the answer is 5, who do you trust? The person whose work shows that the answer is 5. We also want to investigate the material for bias. Has the author included sources that oppose their viewpoint and answered those critiques? How can I put all of this together? Let's look at a real source together and see how well we can apply the SCRAAP test. The first piece is self-awareness. Let's say that I'm working on a research project that asks the question, how does the cost of prescription drugs relate to healthcare usage? I probably have an opinion right away about what I expect to find, so we need to keep that in mind as we search. Next, I need to evaluate how current this article is. This article was published in 2022. That's within the last 2 years, so that's current enough for me. What about relevance? Reading through the abstract, I see that this article is going to examine healthcare costs as well as pharmacy claims, which is another way of describing the cost of prescription drugs. I can be confident then that this article connects to my topic. Next, I want to think about the author's authority. This article has several authors, focusing for the moment only on our first author. I see that Dr. Chang works for Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Chang is a medical doctor working for a well-known and respected hospital in the Department of Health Policy and Management. I can be confident that this author has some experience in the field and writes with the authority granted by holding the right kind of degree and the right job title. The other authors involved in this article have similar credentials, which boosts the authority of the article as a whole. I might be tempted then to decide that this article is accurate because the authors involved have authority. I can't make that decision just yet, though. We're still in the investigation phase. How can I be sure that the material that Dr. Chang and their associates present is accurate? That's right. I'll need to read more material on this topic and decide whether the article fits. I might find that this article is an outlier, but still decide to trust the information because the authors seem credible. What about the purpose of this article? You'll remember that the fun thing about journal articles is that they are written by professionals for professionals. We can trust that the goal of the authors here is to make pharmacy better for other people working in pharmacy. And that's it. Now that you have a better idea about the SCRAAP test, you'll be able to decide whether the sources that you've gathered for your research papers are credible, quality research that will make your paper stronger. Feel free to browse the other videos in our collection to improve your research skills even more.